Welcome back, Book Dragons. I'm so glad you're here. Today we're going to talk about horror from the perspective of a fantasy reader. Now, I know technically horror fits within the category of fantasy, speculative fiction. Most horror has supernatural elements to it with some exceptions. And so it probably seems a little bit weird to be talking about them separately, but the reality is I'm fairly new to horror as a genre. I was sheltered a lot as a child, and my upbringing was very religious, so anything to do with horrific things or demons, vampires, that sort of thing was generally frowned upon. Now, I did rebel against that a little bit, but for the most part, I didn't really do a whole lot with horror just because I wasn't used to it and I was kind of scared. So it wasn't until I was a little bit older that I started getting a stomach for horror. And I kind of started my journey into horror with movies, and I think part of it is that my kids got into horror. And so they're like, Dad, you have to watch these scary movies with us. And I'm like, okay, all right, I'll watch them with you. And I found that I really enjoyed a lot of them. There's some really great supernatural horror stuff out there that I really gravitated to. And I think it was because I'm so drawn to fantasy in general that it really appealed to me. So what I wanted to do today is talk about books that I have read in the horror genre. There's not many, but there are a few. And then talk about books that I want to read, that have been suggested to me or that I've read about. So we're going to go ahead and get right into that. I'm going to put my eyes on here because I've got a list of the books that I want to talk about. The first one I want to talk about is The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. This is probably my favorite of the horror books that I have read, and I know that The Hellbound Heart is pretty horrific on a scale of horror books. I realize that I'm a huge fan of Clive Barker. I really like his writing style. It appealed to me a lot because it feels like his writing style is similar to Neil Gaiman, and his prose is similar to Neil's, and so that already clicked really well with me. And so I read The Hellbound Heart, really enjoyed it, and then of course I watched the original Hellraiser movie, which was based off of The Hellbound Heart, and it was a great adaptation. It was a really bad movie, but it was a great adaptation. They did a great job. It was almost a perfect adaptation in that respect. And then of course I watched the new Hellraiser movie that came out on Hulu a couple years ago. So that was a lot of fun. The next book I want to talk about is It by Stephen King. I'm really hit or miss with Stephen King. Some of his books are really great for me, some of them aren't. And It was one of those that was just kind of meh for me. I almost DNF'd it when I started reading the physical book, and then I read the audiobook on a suggestion by a friend. And so that worked out really well. I was able to finish the book that way, and I think audiobook was just the better way for me to experience it. But overall, I really liked the two movies better than I did the book. It wasn't that great. I didn't really find the book that scary. I mean, there were parts of the movie that were definitely scary, but I don't know. I had seen the movie prior to reading the book, so maybe that's why it didn't really scare me at all. I was just kind of lackluster on the whole deal. It didn't really appeal to me. But I'm glad I read it. I just won't ever read it again, probably. So, speaking of Stephen King, I really liked Salem's Lot. That's actually my favorite Stephen King book. I'm a huge fan of vampires. They're one of my favorite creatures of the night. I'll read any book about vampires. I recently read Empire of the Vampire as well, which is another one of my favorites, just a really excellent book. And so yeah, vampires are really something that I enjoy immensely, and so when I read Salem's Lot, I just ate it up, because it's like a modern day Dracula tale almost. He was inspired by Dracula for that. So yes, vampires are huge for me in terms of my enjoyment of the horror genre. While we're on that topic, another vampire novel that I recently read just a couple of years ago, if I can get it out here, well, helps to open it the right way, Chaz, and that would be Dracula by Bram Stoker. I absolutely loved Bram Stoker's Dracula. Phenomenal book. One of my favorites for sure. I got this nice Folio Society edition because I was just absolutely enamored with, well, don't ruin it there, Chaz. I was just absolutely enamored with Dracula. And yeah, such a great book. And on the topic of vampires, it's right up there with some of the best books that have been written. And another one is Carmilla. So I figured since we're on the topic of vampires, we might as well get all the vampires out of the way. So Carmilla is fantastic. I like Carmilla slightly better than Dracula. Not much, but very slightly. It's just kind of neck and neck. But Carmilla is such a great little book, and such a short book too, really easy reading. I absolutely love this book. So yeah, you can tell that I'm a huge fan of vampires. So when it comes to horror, a lot of the stuff that I have read is in the vampire category. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about is The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. This is about a black street musician who gets wrapped up with a group that serves the old gods like Cthulhu, and he ends up going down a very dark and supernatural path. And it is just so good. Like, Lovecraftian horror is one of my favorite types of horror, cosmic horror. I eat it up, guys. And so reading this book just absolutely wowed me. This is such a great book. If you have not read The Ballad of Black Tom, you seriously need to check it out. Another book that is along the lines of classic horror is The Picture of Dorian Gray. This book surprised me so much because I got to the end of the book, and I love the ending, by the way, but it's a very twisted ending. And the ending could be interpreted a couple of different ways. So you might read it the first time and get one thing out of the ending, and then read it a second or third time and get something different out of the ending, because it ends in a way that you kind of don't know what's being said. You think you do, and maybe you're correct, but you're just not quite sure. At least that's the way it was for me. I have not reread it yet. I plan to at some point. It's definitely a book I would love to reread. So The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde is one of my horror favorites. Another favorite of mine is the Hannibal Lecter series. Now, I've only read Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs. The Silence of the Lambs is absolutely phenomenal, guys. So is Red Dragon, but this one was the best of the two that I've read so far. Dr. Hannibal Lecter is just a creepy goose. He really is. And this doesn't fall into the category of supernatural horror, of course. This is more like psychological horror and psychological manipulation. It's just really, really good. I absolutely love the Hannibal Lecter series so far, so I can't wait to continue this series in my horror journey. So we can't talk about horror without talking about the granddaddies of horror. The first of those is, of course, H.P. Lovecraft. He is such a strange and captivating mind. He really is. The things that he came up with in his writing is just gripping and terrifying at times. Like, can you imagine waking up to some of the monstrosities that he's created? and yet this has stood the test of time. Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and all the different elder gods and the worship of cosmic demons and stuff. Just so much in here in the works of H.P. Lovecraft that I absolutely adore. And I'm so happy I got started reading H.P. Lovecraft when I did. And like I said, I'm fairly new to horror, guys, so it's only been within the last few years that I've actually been reading horror. And one of my first introductions was H.P. Lovecraft, so I absolutely love it. The other one is Edgar Allan Poe. I remember back in school reading Edgar Allan Poe's poems. I had teachers who were fans of Poe and everything, so Edgar Allan Poe is just a brilliant mind. Even though I read it when I was younger, I don't think I was able to appreciate it then the way I appreciate it now. And I'm just so happy that I have Edgar Allan Poe in my reading life. And I continue to get enjoyment from his poems and short stories. So, excellent read. If you have not checked out Edgar Allan Poe, you seriously need to. So, that's just a selection of horror novels that I've read. I've read a few others. Like, one that really sticks out in my head is called Cunning Folk by Adam Neville. That's absolutely a great book. That was one of my patron picks last year, I believe it was, and it was a really good book. So I've read other books, but these are the ones that really kind of stick out in my mind, the ones that have meant the most to me in my horror journey. So now we're going to transition from the horror books that I have read to the horror books that I have not read but I really want to read. And I'm going to grab my list here. The first one I want to talk about here is The Terror by Dan Simmons. I absolutely love Dan Simmons. I'm a huge fan of the Hyperion Cantos. I still haven't read the final book in that series yet, but I really, really like Dan Simmons as a writer, and so I want to continue to explore his works, and one that I've heard is an absolute must-read is The Terror. Another one of his that I really want to read is Summer of Night. And I understand that that is more of a vampire story, at least from what I understand. And I guess he's got a whole series of like seasonal horror books, like there's Summer of Night and Something Spring, and I don't know. But I've heard that there's kind of like a seasonal theme with some of his horror novels. So I'm there for it. It seems like Dan Simmons writes very broadly among a few different genres, so I'm pretty excited to explore his horror novels. Another one that I want to get to is The Scarlet Gospels by Clive Barker. My plan is to read as much Clive Barker as I possibly can, and The Scarlet Gospels really interests me because it features the Cenobites again, from the Hellbound Heart, the Hellraiser movies, Pinhead, all of those. I just am really intrigued by the Scarlet Gospels, so I will be getting into those eventually. I've also heard that the Books of Blood by Clive Barker are really good as well. So I plan to read more by him, and I can't wait to do so. Stay tuned for more on Clive Barker from me. I also want to read Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. I've never read anything by Anne Rice, and I've heard that the books of Lestat are just fantastic. So I'm hoping to read those at some point in the future. I also want to read The Shining by Stephen King. That's right, I've never read The Shining. I've never even seen the movie, guys, which I know is almost unheard of. A lot of people love the book and the movie for different reasons. I am a huge fan of Jack Nicholson, so I'll probably watch it eventually. But I really want to read the book of The Shining first before I see the movie. And then I also want to read Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. I was a huge fan of Fahrenheit 451, and I'd never read any other books by Ray Bradbury, and this one comes highly recommended. So I'm looking forward to reading that. I also want to read Fever Dream by George R. R. Martin. I love George R. R. Martin, but really the only thing I've read of his is A Song of Ice and Fire. I haven't read anything else. I own a couple of his other books, but I haven't read them yet. I don't own Fever Dream, but it is on my list of horror novels to read. And from what I understand, that's his vampire novel. So I'm there, guys. I'll read anything vampires. You give me a vampire book, I'll probably enjoy it. Another book that I've heard is really good. Well, I've heard mixed things about it, but mostly good. And that is The Last House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward. And I don't really know much about it, but I've heard it's really good, and I'll probably check it out at some point in the future. And then the last book on my list here is The Passage by Justin Cronin. I've heard so many good things about Justin Cronin. I know John over at Talking Story is a huge fan of Justin Cronin, and so is Josh over at Red Fury Books and a few others that I've heard. So I'm really excited to try out Justin Cronin, and I've heard that The Passage is one of his best books. So eventually I will be getting down to reading Justin Cronin. But there's so many books, guys, and I do want to broaden my horizons as far as horror goes, but I don't want to sacrifice the other genres that I enjoy for horror as well. So I really want to be selective with the horror books that I put on my list, because I'm not going to exclusively read horror, and I know there's a ton of horror out there. So I'm sure there's a lot of you out there that could give me recommendations for where to go with the horror genre. So this is your chance. Let me know in the comments below some books that you think I would really like that are some of your favorites in the horror genre. I've got a lot of friends out there that love horror. I know I do. So guys, this is your chance. You've watched my videos. You know kind of what my tastes are like. This is your chance to tell me, Chaz, you need to read this book and you need to read this book and this book. Let me know. I'll be listening, okay? And until next time, guys, make sure that you are reading more books, and I will talk to you very soon. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my patrons. I appreciate all you do to help support my channel.